18 years ago, a frightened young black mother disappeared after signing papers she barely understood, believing it was the only way to save her newborn son's life. A lonely white woman stepped forward and devoted every day of the next 18 years to raising him with unconditional love. Now, just days before his 18th birthday, the birth mother returns with proof of the truth and one heartbreaking request. Please, let me take my son home. But what follows is not a legal battle over blood. It is a devastating fight over one impossible question. Who is a real mother? The woman who gave birth, or the woman who never stopped showing up? In a quiet neighborhood where the porch lights came on every evening like clockwork, Sarah Mitchell had spent 18 years building a life around a single purpose. She was 52 years old, a retired high school teacher who had never married, never had children of her own, and never once regretted the choice that changed everything for her. Every morning before the sun fully rose, she was already in the kitchen, cracking eggs into a pan, humming some half-remembered tune from her own childhood, listening for the creak of footsteps on the stairs. Marcus Johnson was 18 now, a senior about to graduate, a young man with broad shoulders and a gentle laugh who had just been offered a scholarship to study engineering. He called her mom without hesitation, the way he had called her that since before he could properly form the word, and there was nothing performative about it. It was simply true. Their mornings had a rhythm built from thousands of repetitions. Sarah would set a plate in front of him, and he would roll his eyes at the vegetables she snuck onto it, and she would remind him that vegetables did not care whether he was almost a man now, they still mattered. On Friday nights, they watched old movies on the couch, the kind with black and white credits, and Marcus always fell asleep halfway through, his head eventually landing on her shoulder, the way it had when he was small enough to carry. Photographs lined the hallway of their small house, a timeline stretching from a swaddled infant to a gap-toothed boy on a bicycle, to a young man in a cap and gown that had not yet been worn. Every frame told the same story, a mother who never left. Sarah had taken him in when he was barely 8 days old, a placement she had been told might only last a matter of weeks while the agency sorted through paperwork, and she had prepared herself, as best a person can, to eventually hand him back to whatever family the system decided he belonged to. Instead, week folded into month, and month folded into year, and no one ever came looking, and somewhere in that long, uncertain stretch of time, Sarah stopped thinking of herself as a temporary caretaker and started thinking of herself simply as his mother. She quit substitute teaching and took a full-time position with better hours so she could be home when he needed her. She sold the small car she loved and bought a used minivan instead, because a minivan, she reasoned, was what a mother drove. Every choice she made from that point forward bent itself around the shape of the boy sleeping down the hall. There had been a man once, years before Marcus arrived, someone Sarah had almost built a life with, but the relationship had ended quietly and without much drama, leaving behind no particular scar, only a sense that perhaps she had simply been waiting for something else to arrive. When Marcus came into her life, she stopped wondering what she had been waiting for. Neighbors sometimes asked, in the careful, prying way small towns ask things, why a single woman would take on a child with no partner to share the weight, and Sarah always answered the same way, that she had never once felt like she was carrying him alone, because loving him had never once felt heavy. Marcus grew up knowing, in the vaguest possible terms, that he had been adopted as an infant. Sarah had never lied about that part. What she withheld, gently and deliberately, were the specifics, the fact that his birth mother was alive, that the separation had not been a clean or fully informed one, that the story was more complicated than the simple, comforting version she offered whenever he asked as a small child. She told herself she was protecting him from confusion he was too young to carry, and later, as the years passed, she told herself the moment to explain further had simply not yet arrived. Somewhere beneath both of those excuses was a fear she rarely allowed herself to examine too closely, the fear that a fuller truth might someday cost her everything she had built. But there was one thing in that house that did not fit the rhythm of their life, something Sarah kept folded away in the back of her bedroom closet, inside an old shoebox with a lid gone soft at the corners. Inside it were 3 things she had never shown Marcus: a birth certificate with a name that was not quite his current one, A handful of photographs taken in a hospital room 18 years earlier, images of a much younger woman holding a newborn, with an expression that mixed exhaustion and devastation in equal measure, and a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly with age, that had never once been opened. Sarah did not know exactly why she kept it. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was a promise she had made to herself the day she brought Marcus home. A promise that someday, if it ever became necessary, the truth would still be waiting, untouched, exactly as it had been given to her. Marcus had noticed the box once, years ago, poking out from beneath a stack of winter sweaters, and Sarah had gently steered him away with a story about old teaching materials that bored him instantly. He never asked again. Children have an instinct for what belongs to them and what does not, and something about the way his mother's face changed when she caught him looking told him this was not his to open. He let it go, the way children often let go of the mysteries adults build around themselves, trusting that whatever it was could wait. He had no idea that the answer to a question he had never thought to ask was sitting 18 inches from where he slept every night, patient as a held breath. 200 miles away, in a different city entirely, a woman named Angela Brooks kept a single photograph in the front pocket of the purse she carried everywhere. She was 46 years old now, and had spent nearly every one of the last 18 years carrying a version of grief that never quite settled into something she could name. The photograph was small, creased from being handled too many times, and showed a newborn baby in a hospital blanket, eyes barely open, a tiny fist curled against his cheek. Angela looked at it most mornings before leaving for work, and most nights before falling asleep. And on the anniversary of his birth every single year, she allowed herself exactly 1 hour to cry, before forcing herself back into the shape of a functioning adult. Colleagues at the assisted living facility where she worked knew almost nothing about that hour, or about the reason behind it. They knew Angela as reliable, quiet, endlessly patient with the residents who forgot her name 3 times in a single conversation, the kind of woman who stayed late without complaint and never asked for anything in return. What they did not know was that her patience had been built the hard way, forged in a decade of nights spent wondering whether her son was warm, whether he was loved, whether he ever thought about the mother who had let him go without ever meaning to let him go at all. She had learned, slowly and painfully, how to carry an ache that never fully closed without letting it consume the rest of her. 18 years earlier, Angela had been 19 years old, homeless and entirely alone. The man she had believed loved her disappeared the moment she told him she was pregnant, and by the time she went into labor 2 months early, she was staying in a shelter that had strict rules about how long anyone could remain. She remembered the fluorescent lights of the hospital room, the sound of machines monitoring a baby too small and too fragile, and the exhaustion that made every decision feel like wading through water. It was in that state, barely 24 hours after giving birth, that a hospital social worker sat beside her bed with a folder of papers and a voice that sounded kind but moved quickly. The woman had explained, in a tone gentle enough to disguise its urgency, that Angela's son needed stability she could not currently provide, that there was a temporary arrangement that would ensure he received proper medical care while she got back on her feet, and that signing the documents would open the door to exactly that kind of help. Angela, exhausted, frightened, and desperate to believe that someone was offering her son a chance she could not, signed where she was told to sign. She believed, with the fierce and uninformed hope of someone too young and too tired to ask the right questions, that this was temporary. She believed that once she found steady work, once she found a stable place to live, she would return, and her son would be waiting. It took nearly 2 years for Angela to understand what those papers had actually been. By the time she pieced together the truth, that she had not signed a temporary care agreement, but a full and final relinquishment of parental rights, the trail had gone cold. The agency that arranged it had closed. Records were sealed. Every door she tried led to another wall, and every year that passed made the search feel more impossible and more shameful, as though her own desperation 18 years earlier had somehow made her unworthy of trying again. She built a life anyway, working double shifts as a home health aide and later 3 separate part-time jobs, saving money she barely had for a search she was not even sure she had the right to pursue. She never married. She never had another child. Some quiet, stubborn part of her believed that doing either would mean giving up on the son she had never stopped looking for, so she simply did not allow herself either kind of future. It was a private investigator, finally affordable after years of saving, who found the thread that led back to Sarah Mitchell's front door. Angela stood on the porch of a house she had never seen before, in a neighborhood she had never visited, holding a manila folder with copies of documents that proved what she already knew in her bones. Her hand hovered over the doorbell for what felt like an eternity before she finally pressed it, and when the door opened, she found herself face to face with the woman who had spent 18 years raising her son. Sarah recognized nothing about the stranger on her porch. Not immediately, but there was something in the woman's eyes, a kind of aching familiarity, that made her chest tighten before a single word was spoken. Angela introduced herself carefully, her voice trembling but steady enough to get the sentence out. She said simply that she was Marcus's biological mother. Sarah felt the words land like something physical, a weight dropping through her stomach, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, standing frozen in her own doorway, while 18 years of quiet fear finally arrived at her door in human form. What surprised Sarah most was what Angela did not do. She did not demand entry. She did not accuse. She did not produce lawyers or threats or ultimatums. She simply stood there, folder held against her chest like a shield, and asked in a voice barely above a whisper if she might be allowed to see him, just once, just to know that he was alive and well. Sarah, still reeling, found herself nodding before she had fully decided to, some instinct telling her that whatever came next needed to begin with honesty rather than denial. She invited Angela inside and asked her to wait in the living room while she went to find Marcus. He was upstairs finishing homework when Sarah knocked softly on his door and asked him to come down, her voice carrying a strain he had never heard from her before. Marcus followed her down the staircase, confused by the tension in the house, and stopped short at the bottom step when he saw a woman he did not recognize standing in his living room. For a moment, nobody moved. Angela's eyes filled with tears the second she saw him. 18 years of longing crashing into a single instant of recognition, and she pressed a hand over her mouth, as if trying to hold back a sound too large for the room. Marcus looked between the two women, utterly lost, sensing something enormous was happening without understanding its shape. Sarah's hands were shaking at her sides. Angela took a small, careful step forward, drinking in every detail of his face, as though she were memorizing something she had waited a lifetime to see. Marcus, still a stranger to his own story, simply stood there, unsure whether to be polite or afraid, watching a woman cry in his living room for reasons no one had yet explained to him. That night, after Angela had gone, promising to return when everyone was ready, Sarah sat Marcus down at the kitchen table and finally opened the shoebox that had waited 18 years in the dark. She laid out the birth certificate, the hospital photographs, and the sealed envelope she had never touched. And she told him everything, gently but without softening the truth into something easier to swallow. She told him he had been adopted as an infant. She told him his birth mother had not died, as he had always assumed from the vague, careful things Sarah said whenever the topic came up in childhood. She told him the woman in the living room, the one crying, was his biological mother, and that everything he thought he knew about the beginning of his own life had been in some sense incomplete. Marcus sat in silence for a long time after she finished speaking, staring at the photographs of a baby he could not recognize as himself. Something in his chest felt like it had cracked open, not violently, but with a slow, spreading pressure that made it hard to breathe normally. He felt betrayed, though he could not immediately articulate why. Since Sarah had done nothing but love him for 18 years, he felt unmoored, as though the ground beneath a life he had never questioned had suddenly revealed itself to be something other than solid earth. He asked Sarah, in a voice thinner than his usual one, why she had never told him sooner, and she had no answer that felt adequate, only the honest admission that she had been afraid, every single day, of exactly this moment. In the days that followed, Marcus grew distant in ways that frightened Sarah more than any argument could have. He stopped coming down for breakfast at his usual time. He answered her questions in single words, if he answered at all. He spent long hours in his room with the door closed, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the boy he had always believed himself to be with the sudden, disorienting knowledge that his entire origin story had a second half he had never been told. Meanwhile, Angela began reaching out carefully, sending a text message here, a small gift there, trying to build a bridge without pushing too hard, terrified that any misstep might cost her the fragile thread she had only just regained. Marcus found himself caught in a kind of vertigo that had nothing to do with physical space. He would look in the mirror and wonder which parts of his face came from a woman he had known his whole life without knowing at all. He would sit in class, half listening to a lecture, and suddenly be seized by the question of who he actually was, whether identity was something built by blood or by years of shared mornings and shared grief and shared laughter. He did not know how to hold both truths at once, that Sarah was his mother in every way that had ever mattered to him, and that Angela was his mother in a way written into his very cells, and the effort of trying exhausted him in a way nothing else ever had. His best friend since middle school, a boy named Tyler, who had spent countless afternoons in Sarah's kitchen eating her cooking, noticed the change before anyone else did. Marcus stopped showing up to practice on time. He stopped laughing at things that would have made him laugh easily a month earlier. When Tyler finally asked what was wrong, Marcus tried to explain it, and found that the words simply would not arrange themselves into anything coherent, that there was no simple sentence for the feeling of discovering an entire hidden continent attached to the map of your own life. Tyler listened without judgment, and though he could not fix anything, the act of being heard without being pushed toward an answer gave Marcus a small measure of relief he had not realized he needed. At night, Marcus found himself replaying every conversation he had ever had with Sarah about his origins, searching for clues he might have missed, moments where the truth had brushed close to the surface without ever quite breaking through. He remembered asking her once, as a young boy, whether his birth mother had died, and remembered Sarah's careful, ambiguous answer, something about his birth mother not being able to take care of him. He had accepted it then without question, the way children accept most things adults tell them. But now the memory felt different, less like protection and more like omission, and he was not yet sure how to forgive the difference. It was Angela who finally suggested they simply spend time together, no expectations, no pressure, just the chance to know one another as people rather than as symbols of a legal and emotional storm. Marcus agreed, more out of curiosity than resolve, and the two of them began meeting at a small diner near his school every few days after class. Angela told him about her life, in careful, unhurried pieces, not to elicit pity, but because she wanted him to understand the shape of the years he had missed. She told him about the 3 jobs she had worked simultaneously for over a decade, how she had never married, never had another child, how every decision she made had been shadowed by the son she believed she would someday find again. Marcus listened, and something in him softened, even as something else in him ached. He could see, in the tired lines around her eyes and the careful way she chose her words, a devotion that had cost her nearly everything. He found himself moved by her story in ways he had not expected, moved enough that guilt began creeping in during the quiet drive home each time, because every warm feeling toward Angela seemed to arrive paired with an unspoken betrayal of Sarah. And Sarah, for her part, never made him choose out loud, never once asked where he had been, or with whom, though the exhaustion in her eyes told him she already knew. One evening, Angela brought a small photo album to the diner, worn at the edges from years of handling, filled with pictures of her own mother and grandmother, women Marcus had never met, but whose faces carried unmistakable echoes of his own. She told him stories about them, about a grandmother who had sung in a church choir for 40 years, about an uncle who could fix any engine ever built, weaving together a family history that had existed in parallel to his entire life without him ever knowing it was there. Marcus found himself hungry for these details, in a way that surprised him, filling in gaps in his own reflection that he had never realized were missing. At the same time, he began noticing, with a kind of tender ache, all the small ways Sarah had shaped him, without either of them ever naming it directly. His habit of double-checking locked doors before bed, learned from her nightly ritual, his love of old black and white films, absorbed from 1,000 shared Friday nights. The particular way he apologized, careful and specific rather than vague, a trait he later realized was simply Sarah's own way of speaking. Worn into him through 18 years of proximity, he began to understand that nature had given him a face and a bloodline, but nurture had given him nearly everything else, and that both gifts, however differently earned, were entirely real. Each evening he returned home to find dinner still warm on the stove, his laundry folded in familiar stacks on his bed, the porch light glowing exactly as it always had. Sarah never confronted him about where his afternoons had gone. She simply kept showing up, the way she had for 18 years, offering nothing but consistency. In a moment when consistency felt like the rarest thing in the world, Marcus began to understand, in a slow and painful way, that loving one mother did not require him to stop loving the other, but that the two loves pulled at him from opposite directions, and that whichever way he leaned would leave someone standing alone in the space he had walked away from. The tension became unbearable in ways neither woman had anticipated. Marcus grew quieter at school, distracted during practice, unable to finish sentences during dinner without trailing off into some private thought neither Sarah nor his friends could reach. He began to dread the moment he would inevitably have to choose, not because anyone was forcing the choice explicitly, but because the situation itself seemed to demand resolution, a single answer to a question that had no single correct answer at all. He lay awake most nights, turning the same impossible thought over and over, wondering if there was a version of his life where he did not have to pick a winner between the two people who loved him most. It did not take long for the story to spread beyond the walls of their small house. A neighbor who had seen Angela's tearful visit mentioned it to another neighbor, and within a matter of weeks, the entire town seemed to know some fragmented, half-accurate version of events. People who had never met Sarah, Angela, or Marcus began forming opinions with startling confidence, discussing the situation in grocery store aisles and church parking lots as though they held some personal stake in its outcome. Lines were drawn quickly and without much nuance. Some insisted that blood was the only thing that truly mattered, that a birth mother's rights could never be erased by paperwork signed under duress, and that Angela deserved to reclaim what had been taken from her through deception. Others argued just as fiercely that 18 years of daily devotion could not simply be undone by a stranger arriving with old photographs and a compelling story. They pointed to every school play Sarah had attended, every fever she had nursed through the night, every dollar she had saved for Marcus's education, insisting that motherhood was built through presence, not biology, and that Sarah alone had earned the title through relentless, unglamorous years of showing up. The arguments grew louder and uglier as they spread, twisting facts, inventing details, reducing three complicated human beings into simplified villains and heroes, depending on which side was speaking. Marcus felt the weight of every one of those opinions pressing down on him, even though most of the people expressing them had never exchanged a single word with him. He began avoiding certain classmates whose families had strong opinions about his situation, and he stopped checking messages from numbers he did not recognize, tired of strangers inserting themselves into a wound that was already raw enough on its own. Angela, too, found herself the target of cruel speculation, people questioning why she had waited so long, whispering that perhaps she only wanted Marcus now that he was grown and successful, accusations that cut deeper than she let anyone see. Sarah bore the harshest labels of all. Some called her a kidnapper, despite having done nothing but accept a child through an agency that had, at the time, presented everything as legal and above board. Others called her selfish, accused her of manipulating an innocent boy to serve her own loneliness, painted her as a woman who had built her identity around a child that was never truly hers to keep. Through all of it, Sarah never once spoke a harsh word about Angela in public or in private, never used the noise of the community to strengthen her position, choosing instead to remain quiet, dignified, and focused entirely on Marcus's well-being rather than her own reputation. At the grocery store one afternoon, a woman Sarah had known for years, someone she had once considered a friend, stopped her in the cereal aisle and asked, without much tact, whether she felt any guilt at all for keeping a mother from her child for 18 years. Sarah stood there for a long moment, gripping the handle of her cart, and simply said that she had done what she believed was right with the information she had been given, and that she hoped, whatever the outcome, Marcus would end up with more love in his life rather than less. She walked away before her voice could break in public and cried quietly in her car in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before she felt steady enough to drive home. Angela faced her own version of that cruelty. A woman at her church, upon hearing the story secondhand, remarked loudly enough for Angela to hear that some people only wanted their children back once those children had grown into something worth having, a comment so unfair and so far from the truth of Angela's 18 years of searching that it left her shaking with anger she rarely allowed herself to feel. She did not respond to the woman directly. Instead, she went home, took out the photograph she had carried for 18 years, and reminded herself, as she had reminded herself countless times before, that she did not owe strangers an explanation for a grief they had never had to survive. It was during the storm of outside judgment that Marcus, alone in his room one evening, finally reached for the shoebox Sarah had shown him weeks earlier. He had avoided the sealed envelope until now, unwilling to face whatever truth it might contain. But something about the noise outside, the endless opinions of people who knew nothing real about his life, pushed him toward the one voice he had not yet heard, the voice of the woman who had written it before he was even a day old. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal that had held for 18 years, and he unfolded a single sheet of paper covered in handwriting that looked young, uncertain, and achingly sincere. The letter had been written by Angela in the hospital, in the hours after she signed the papers she did not fully understand, before the fog of exhaustion and grief had fully lifted enough for her to grasp what she had actually done. In it, she had poured out everything she could not say aloud to anyone, telling her son that she was not abandoning him because she did not love him, but because she believed, in that desperate moment, that letting go was the only way to give him a chance at a life she could not provide. She wrote that if he ever read these words, she hoped only that he had grown up happy, safe, and surrounded by love, and that she would carry the ache of missing him for as long as she lived, regardless of whether they ever met again. Marcus read the letter 3 times before he could bring himself to move, tears falling freely onto the paper in a way he did not try to stop. He carried it downstairs and found Sarah in the kitchen, and when she saw the envelope in his hand, her face went pale, with a kind of guilt she had carried silently for nearly 2 decades. She confessed, in a voice thick with emotion, that she had never once opened it, not out of indifference but out of a fierce, almost sacred belief that the letter belonged to Marcus and to his birth mother alone, that it was not hers to read, no matter how curious or afraid she had been over the years. That confession changed something in the room, and in Marcus, and eventually in Angela when she learned of it days later. For the first time since Angela's arrival, Angela understood with total clarity that Sarah had never tried to erase her from Marcus's story, had never destroyed the letter, or hidden the box, or pretended the past did not exist. Sarah had, instead, guarded the truth for 18 years, waiting for a day she hoped would never come but preparing for it anyway, because some part of her had always known that Marcus deserved the whole of his own history, even the parts that might one day threaten to take him away from her. Angela made a decision then that surprised the lawyer she had eventually consulted. She filed a petition with the court, but not for custody, and not to challenge the adoption that had shaped Marcus's entire life. She filed simply for legal recognition of her identity as his biological mother and for a formal, protected right to remain part of his life going forward, whatever form that might take. She wanted nothing torn down. She wanted, after 18 years of silence, only to be acknowledged, and to never again risk losing access to the son she had found. Her lawyer had initially urged her toward a stronger position, pointing out that the circumstances of the original relinquishment, the confusion, the pressure, the lack of proper counsel given to a frightened teenager, might well support a much more aggressive claim if Angela wanted to pursue one. Angela refused, telling him plainly that she had not spent 18 years searching for her son, only to become the reason his entire world was dismantled the moment she found him. She wanted a door left open, not a house rebuilt from the foundation up, and she made it clear that no legal strategy was worth the cost of Marcus's trust. The hearing took place on a gray morning in a courtroom that felt far too formal for a story built almost entirely out of love and loss. Attorneys on both sides presented their arguments with careful precision, citing statutes and precedents, but the air in the room shifted the moment Sarah was asked to speak. She stood, hands folded, voice steady, despite the tremor Marcus could see in her shoulders, and she said something that silenced the entire courtroom. She told the judge that if Marcus, of his own free will, wished to go and build a life with his biological mother, she would not fight it, would not resist, and would personally help him pack every box himself. She continued, her voice growing quieter, but no less certain, explaining that she had never raised Marcus to keep him, that she had raised him to become a whole person, capable of making his own choices, and that if his choice led him away from her, she would consider her 18 years a success rather than a failure. She said she had always known, somewhere beneath the daily business of school lunches and homework and bedtime stories, that he did not belong to her in the way a possession belongs to its owner, that he had only ever been entrusted to her, and that trust, she believed, did not come with permanent ownership attached. Angela broke down in tears the moment the words left Sarah's mouth, overwhelmed by a generosity she had not expected and did not feel she deserved. Marcus, seated between the two women's attorneys, wept as well. Watching the woman who raised him offer to release her greatest joy without a single condition attached. The judge, visibly moved, called for a brief recess, and in that pause, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath together, waiting to see what would happen when the person at the center of it all was finally given the chance to speak for himself. When the hearing resumed, Marcus asked the judge for permission to address the court directly, and it was granted without hesitation. He rose slowly, his voice cracking at first, before steadying into something clear and certain. He said that he could not choose between them, that he had spent weeks trying to find a version of the truth where choosing made sense, and that he had finally realized the question itself was the wrong one to ask. He turned first to Angela and thanked her, simply and sincerely, for giving him life, for the courage it must have taken to carry him and to search for him for 18 relentless years. He told her that he had spent a long time being angry at a story he did not fully understand, and that reading her letter had finally allowed him to see the difference between a mother who walked away and a mother who was deceived into believing walking away was the only way to save him. He told her he forgave her, not because there was anything left to forgive, but because he thought she needed to hear the words spoken aloud, after carrying the weight of it silently for so long. Angela pressed a hand to her chest, unable to speak, nodding through tears that would not stop. Then he turned to Sarah, and his voice broke completely as he thanked her for every single day since, for every breakfast, every fever, every late night spent proofreading college essays, for choosing him again and again when nothing legally obligated her to keep choosing him at all. He said that he did not have one mother standing before him. He said he had two, and that he refused to spend the rest of his life pretending one of them mattered less than the other, simply because the world seemed to want a simpler, cleaner story than the one he actually had. The courtroom, filled with strangers who had spent weeks arguing over which woman deserved the title, fell completely silent, and then, quietly, began to weep along with them. The judge, after a long pause to compose herself, ruled in a way that satisfied everyone in the room, without requiring anyone to lose anything. Marcus's adoption would remain fully intact, his legal relationship with Sarah untouched and unquestioned. Angela would be granted formal, permanent recognition as his biological mother, along with every right of contact and relationship that designation implied, freely offered rather than contested. Nobody left that courtroom feeling as though they had won a battle. Everyone left feeling, for the first time in months, that the war itself had simply never needed to happen. The months that followed brought a kind of peace none of them had expected to find so quickly. Marcus enrolled in his engineering program that fall, and on the day he moved into his dormitory, both Sarah and Angela arrived to help, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs together, bumping elbows in doorways, laughing at the absurdity of 2 grown women trying to assemble the same poorly labeled bookshelf. Sarah taught Angela how to make the pasta dish Marcus had loved since childhood, guiding her carefully through a recipe that had once been theirs alone. Angela, in turn, showed Sarah old photographs from her side of the family, faces Marcus had never seen, a grandmother's eyes, and an uncle's laugh lines that lived on unmistakably in his own features. At first, the arrangement felt fragile. The two women testing the shape of a friendship neither had expected to build, careful with one another in the way people are careful when they know a single wrong word could reopen an old wound. But something steadier grew between them over the following weeks. An understanding built not on obligation but on a shared devotion to the same young man, and eventually genuine warmth followed, where careful politeness had been. Sarah began calling Angela occasionally just to talk, not about Marcus at all, but about ordinary things, a recipe, a rough day at work, the small currency of real friendship. Angela started doing the same, and neither of them ever spoke of it as strange, because by then it no longer felt strange at all. Marcus called them both every week without fail, splitting his stories evenly between them without ever quite meaning to, telling Sarah about his coursework, and telling Angela about the new friends he had made in his dormitory, weaving both women naturally into the ordinary fabric of his new life, rather than keeping them in separate, careful compartments. He came home for Thanksgiving that year to find both of them in Sarah's kitchen, elbow to elbow at the counter, arguing cheerfully over how much garlic the stuffing actually needed, and something in his chest settled permanently at the sight of it, a peace he had not believed possible just months earlier. On that final afternoon before they said their goodbyes and left him to his new life, the three of them stood together outside the dormitory for a photograph, the first the three of them had ever taken together. Marcus stood in the middle, one hand resting in Sarah's, the other resting in Angela's, and for the first time since this entire story began, nobody in the frame looked uncertain about where they belonged. He smiled at the camera, and later, when he looked back at that photograph, he would remember thinking that home had never been about the place where he happened to be born. It was, he realized, wherever love had simply refused to let him go. Angela never lost her son again, not after that. Sarah never lost the young man she had poured 18 years of her life into raising, not after that either. And Marcus, walking into adulthood with a fuller understanding of his own beginning than either woman could have given him alone, carried both of them forward, not as rivals in his story, but as its two truest authors. Blood may open the door to a life, but it takes years of relentless, unglamorous, unconditional presence to build what waits on the other side of it. And in the end, that was the lesson none of the three of them ever had to say out loud again, because they had already lived it.